Honourable member for Durham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And it's my pleasure to rise today for the second time in debate on Bill C-10. And I'm going to share with members my thoughts on the bill, which stem more from my concern about the government's reckless handling of the airline and the aerospace industry in Canada, and in particular their handling and the circumstances that gave rise to Bill C-10. In an era of open and transparency and sunny ways, Bill C-10 has arrived in this Parliament under the most cloudy or perhaps murky ways, Madam Speaker. And I think the government, and particularly the Minister of Transport, who is an honourable member of this House and a great Canadian, need to be more forthright on. And I think some of the concerns we've heard from my friends in the New Democratic Party stem as much from this uncertainty on how C-10 came to this House. And I say that concern about process because this House should have process that is transparent, and we should know how bills have come to this House. Because I will say, and you'll see in my remarks, Madam Speaker, that the substance of C-10 on a specific level, I agree with in some ways, and I'll explain why. But I would prefer the government to be open and transparent with this House and manage this industry and our airlines and transportation in a way that reflects the modern realities of this global sector where Canada is currently extremely competitive and, in fact, a world leader, but due to inaction and poor vision that we've seen in 6 months already, this industry could indeed suffer. Bill C-10 is really the completion of something that started in the 1980s, Madam Speaker, under the Mulroney government when Air Canada was privatized. It was a Crown corporation. We all remember, I think, my first few flights on Air Canada would have been when it was a Crown company and a Crown carrier. And like many countries in the world, in the early days of aviation, to keep their business and their society competitive and modern, a lot of governments owned stakes or owned their national airlines. But starting in the 1960s through to the 1980s, most of the developed world devolved ownership, so that governments, we're not elected and we don't have a government in Ottawa to run businesses on behalf of Canadians, but often in a sector, particularly like aerospace, the trailblazing front edge of an industry like passenger and cargo transport can be assisted by government. So by the time the Mulroney government came in, Canada was joining most modern nations and allowing the private sector and the private marketplace to run and operate airlines with the appropriate degree of regulation, Madam Speaker. And, it's a very heavily regulated industry on a federal level, and the airline, I think, like all airlines, do their best to maintain high standards alongside those regulations. So at the time of the Mulroney government, when Air Canada was privatized, there was concern about some of the major servicing sectors and many of the job centres that were part of the Crown Corporation. So part of the government's operation in important markets, namely Winnipeg, Montreal, and Mississauga, Madam Speaker. And quite easy to understand why those markets were so important at the time in those cities. You had the servicing and claims elements in Manitoba. You had the hub of Pearson Airport in Mississauga, and you had the head office of Air Canada in Montreal. Montreal also having world-class renown as the international headquarters for ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, governing air travel and recognizing its global footprint, Madam Speaker. So Montreal was very much an appropriate home for Air Canada and continues to be. So there were specific job provisions put in at the time because of concern about the change. This a change almost 30 years ago, Madam Speaker. And I think if you ask Canadians today, and I haven't heard any of my friends in the NDP look for these statistics, and I probably know why, I bet you 90% of Canadians would agree that the governments should not own an airline. in this modern age, but probably understood why 40 or 50 years ago they started out by helping Canadians gain access to air travel. But we would not suggest turning the page and going back to Canada running an airline serving Canadians. So the jobs related to those jurisdictions were a critical part of the transition. And Prime Minister Mulroney and his government at the time wanted to assure the House and, of course, all Canadians that there wouldn't be radical disruption of the important hubs in Winnipeg, Mississauga, and Montreal by the change. So they had the Air Canada Public Participation Act. And what is the government doing here? They're not destroying this concept, Madam Speaker, but they're allowing it to evolve as it should. Rather than specifically naming a geographic coordinate, the changes to Section 1D or 6(1)D of the Act allow for a more geographic balancing to Manitoba, to the southern Ontario, to the greater Montreal area, recognizing that there will still remain hubs, but giving the company some ability to modernize and to have competitive servicing and operational support for their operations. Because I don't think, and myself as a free market person and somebody from the private sector, Madam Speaker, I don't think we should be shackling a business to an operational approach that was in practice 30 years ago. And this is the last shackle, in many ways, of the privatization of Air Canada, is modernization of the Public Participation Act. So you can see from my remarks, Madam Speaker, in principle, I think this makes sense. And in many ways, it also recognizes what provincial governments have already understood. So litigation launched in Manitoba and in Quebec by provincial governments alongside the labour movement in those jurisdictions. The litigation were settled in two of those provinces as a result of agreements. There were agreements for job security and some contracting to service providers, world-class service providers in Manitoba, and similar commercial agreements were made with Quebec, and litigation pulled away. What really has happened here, and the minister has not informed the House fully on the circumstances of how C-10 appeared out of the blue. Was this an effort by the federal government to try and resolve all litigation related to this act? Probably, Madam Speaker. Was this litigation, or was this bill, C-10, the result of discussions between the federal government, Bombardier, and Air Canada? Probably, Madam Speaker, but we haven't heard the minister speak to that. We do know that senior executives from Air Canada met with the minister a few days before C-10 was tabled in this Parliament, and coincidentally, Air Canada committed to buying C-Series Bombardier aircraft. Now, they should buy those aircraft, Madam Speaker, because they're amongst the best in the world, and we're very proud of Bombardier. I'll speak about that company in a moment. But when you look at this chain of reality, the litigation between the provinces, the difficulties that Bombardier has faced, the restrictions in terms of regulations and restrictions imposed on Air Canada from legislation dating back to 1988, all of this leads up to C-10, Madam Speaker. And the urgency of it and the urgency of the financial assistance the province of Quebec has already given to Bombardier, all of this leads to C-10, Madam Speaker. And I would prefer if the minister just said that to the House. And I think my NDP colleagues would prefer that as well, because any industry analyst knows why C-10 is before this place. And I think in my remarks you can see that, in principle, I think the full privatization and the unshackling of some of the rules from 1988 should take place. My concern with C-10 is the secret deals, Madam Speaker, and the very fact that we're asking in this House whether the federal government is going to provide assistance to Bombardier like the province of Quebec has, and have there been any assurances with respect to dual-class shares with respect to that company? Have there been any assurances in terms of whether it will be a loan, whether we will use EDC to backstop other countries buying the C-Series aircraft? Or, indeed, did they work with Air Canada to remedy some of these labour challenges alongside a purchase? You know, I don't think you need to be an investigator to see that there's more to C-10 than the few words on the paper of the bill, Madam Speaker. And I really wish a government that came to Ottawa saying open, transparency, they enjoy consulting in a lot of ways on things, Madam Speaker. This is one area that we have not received a full background on, and we have not really heard from the minister on what led to C-10 and the backroom deals, Madam Speaker. And that's why I have serious concerns and why I'm speaking again on this bill. And I urge the minister, who is an honourable member of this House and someone who's respected across our aerospace industry as our first astronaut, Madam Speaker, to level with us. You know, that's what we're supposed to have when we're modernizing this industry. I think the concerns from organized labour that some of my friends in the NDP would be addressed by more transparency and more direct discussion on amendments to the Air Canada Public Participation Act. And there is still time, Madam Speaker, for the minister to become forthright on this. I have a deep affinity for the Bombardier company, Madam Speaker, and I think all members of this House, particularly our strong Quebec caucus on the Conservative side, have strong passion for Bombardier. I received my wings in the Royal Canadian Air Force after training on the CT-142 aircraft, Madam Speaker, a militarized version of the Dash 8 for air navigation training run out of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Madam Speaker. So the aerospace jobs in Winnipeg I'm familiar with very well because they're approximate to where the air base is located on the far side of the international airport. And the Royal Canadian Air Force, which I was a proud member of, has its headquarters in Winnipeg. So Winnipeg, at the geographic center of North America and of Canada, will remain an important hub for the aerospace industry, and I think we can be very proud of those jobs, Madam Speaker. And in many ways, the Conservatives and our Conservative family were in the wilderness for many years because of an ill-timed decision by the Mulroney government to push forward on a servicing contract for CF-18s that impacted Bristol Aerospace in Manitoba, Madam Speaker. So nobody knows about the aerospace industry probably as much as Conservatives because it gave rise in many ways to the Reform Party and the split between the PCs for many years, and that's not lost on me in this debate. But, Madam Speaker, we want Bombardier to succeed. We want to see a modernized corporate structure and effective governance and effective leadership within that organization. We want the C-Series, which is best-in-class aircraft, really will be transformative in terms of fuel efficiency, in terms of reducing aircraft noise. It will be transformative for the sector and for that company, Madam Speaker. And they should have orders from across the globe, and they're coming in. And if orders are related to bills before this House, if orders are related to the assistance governments might offer that company and the flagship carrier of Canada, we should know about that, and this should be part of the debate. I do have to raise the fact that why I'm concerned, the murkiness with respect to C-10 also relates to decisions around Billy Bishop Airport. And I'm glad I just heard a guffaw from my friend from Trinity Spadina Fort York. That's another case where we did not get the full briefing and discussion by the minister on decisions related to the long-term operations of that important hub, Madam Speaker. In fact, we're quite disappointed. He tweeted out the cancellation of the project looking into an expansion of that airport, Madam Speaker. An airport now that has become critical to the transportation needs not just of a few hundred people living on the lakeshore, but of the 5 million people, Madam Speaker, in the most populous part of our country. And I know the member from Spadina Fort York doesn't like the fact that many of his colleagues come to Ottawa each week using Porter, but he has to admit that its location near the financial center of our country makes it a critical asset that at least should have proper regulatory review and not more insider deals, Madam Speaker. So here we have deals being cooked inside the Minister of Transportation's office when he meets with corporate officials. We also have deals being cooked inside the Liberal caucus and in the PMO, Madam Speaker, that actually impact far more than just one riding. It impacts Southern Ontario in the flow of goods and services and people. And whether or not there should be an expansion, those decisions and a fulsome discussion should be open and transparent, particularly in the era of sunny ways, Madam Speaker. And why is that germane to this debate? Because Porter was planning to purchase up to 30 C-Series aircraft. And I know my friend who's enjoying my remarks across the way, he'll likely be out of town when his government announces their financial assistance from Bombardier, which they will, and we'll look at very carefully in the opposition. But the interesting thing is their insider deals prevented a private sector sale of these very aircraft that would help Bombardier and help it thrive. I know this week on the Hill, and I was speaking to them, we also have a new ultra-low-cost carrier in Canada looking to start up, the Jetlines airline, Madam Speaker, that also plans to purchase between 20 and 40 C-Series aircraft from Bombardier, Madam Speaker, provided the government starts setting an open and even playing field within Canada for our airline and aerospace industry, Madam Speaker. And I know my friend from Prince George, with his remarkable experience in aviation and the airline and airport industry, knows that a lot of our secondary markets are underserved because we have a restrictive set of rules around airline ownership, the capitalization of our aerospace industry. Why is that important? The last government, we were looking at changing that, Madam Speaker. We had the Emerson report that said, because of our small capital markets here in Canada, because the airline industry is indeed global, we should be allowing up to 49% ownership or capital to come from outside of Canada. It's the same challenge, Madam Speaker, we face constantly in the resource industry. We have tremendous opportunity, but not necessarily the size of our capital markets to service it. So we need to draw capital in from around the world. We also have to recognize that this industry is a global industry, Madam Speaker. You know, I know a lot of veterans and friends I serve with in the RCAF. They fly for their Air Canada. I have a friend, Kevin McNaughton, just flying for WestJet at the moment, a former F-18 pilot. There's also Canadians flying for Cathay Pacific, for Qantas. This is a global industry, and in fact, my friend from British Columbia he consulted around the world. Canadian expertise in terms of aerospace, airlines, NAV Canada, which is a world leader, Madam Speaker. This is a global marketplace, and for our airlines to succeed, we need to have an even playing field, Madam Speaker. So I was proud the last government started evening that playing field somewhat. We allowed more standardized crew days and manning levels for air crews and for service personnel on the aircraft, flight attendants, Madam Speaker, so that there was a same level of requirement in Canada as there were to airlines flying into Canada. We need to also do that in terms of the access to capital. We need to allow these small upstart airlines like Jetlines and others to have access to foreign capital so that they can acquire aircraft built in Canada, Madam Speaker. So I urge the Minister to look at the Emerson report, look about allowing and unshackling this industry so that Canadians can compete. There are 76,000 jobs in Canada and almost $30 billion in GDP from the aerospace industry alone, Madam Speaker. And the aircraft built by Viking Air now, but our classic de Havilland, like the Beaver, the Twin Otter, these are world-renowned aircraft, Madam Speaker. The C-Series will be joining that sort of world-renowned Canadian expertise that has always kept us as the third or fourth most important aerospace country in the world. So less backroom deals, Madam Speaker, more transparency, and let's not have another bill that comes to this House like C-10 under the murkiness and indecision that we've seen from this government. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Spadina-Fort York.
Well, I thank the honourable member opposite for allowing me to once again try to provide fact and information for the analysis of the party opposite when they discussed the proposal that was never going to go anywhere at Bishop Airport. It was never 30 planes. It was never 30 jets. It was never 30 jets. It was 12 jets and 18 Q400s. The Q400 order can still go forward and likely will still go forward because we haven't closed the airport. The airport is still allowed to operate its current configuration. The 12 jets that they tried to shoehorn into an airport and grow an airport to the size of the Ottawa International, this is the proposal that the Conservatives keep presenting to us as a viable operation. They wanted to build the Ottawa International Airport on a piece of property that is 1/7 the landmass. It was going to cost close to $1.4 billion to shoehorn into this airport. Is this really the depth of analysis that the Conservatives have brought to this issue? They don't know the number of the planes, they don't know the infrastructure costs, they don't know the length of the runway, and they don't know what the hell they're talking about.
C'est acceptable, non? So I just want to remind the member from Spadina-Fort York that, you know, we want to make sure that we use language that's acceptable to all here, and would appreciate that he chooses words correctly. The honourable member for Durham.
Madam Speaker, I accept the apology from my friend from Spadina-Fort York, and in light of recent events, I'm just glad he didn't run across the way and grab me, as his leader has provided by example. But what I would say to this House, and in response to his question, he asked about the depth of analysis. They cut off that analysis, Madam Speaker. We needed a process where we could look at the viability of that in the long term, the environmental concerns, how it would fit into the transportation hub, any of the other issues, noise, all that sort of stuff. What the cancellation does on pressures on Pearson, Hamilton, the closure of Buttonville. The Toronto Island Airport, Billy Bishop, is not isolated from a network that serves over 5 million people, Madam Speaker. So the depth of analysis is more than a 140-character tweet from his minister. It should be allowing this process to run its course, particularly when there was going to be a private sector sale, whether it was 12 aircraft or down the road 30, it was a sale that was going to be private sector, not the government's money.
Comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Regina Louvain. Oh, sorry. Did I not? Regina Louvain, right?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The member for Durham and I share a common first name, but unfortunately we don't share a common understanding of Bill C-10. He suggested that it was no big deal to loosen the geographic requirements from Winnipeg to all of Manitoba, or from Mississauga to southern Ontario. But of course, the real concern about Bill C-10 is the clause that gives Air Canada complete free rein to define the nature of those maintenance and employment requirements. At the extreme, Air Canada could comply with this legislation by maintaining one job in each of Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. I think, Madam Speaker, it's also very important to recognize the origin of these maintenance and employment requirements. When a former Conservative government was privatizing Air Canada, it made a trade-off. It decided to place this restriction, giving up maybe some of the proceeds that could have been obtained by selling the government's equity in the airline in exchange for a guarantee of jobs. So given that that trade-off has been made, even if the member for Durham doesn't think it's the right trade-off, what's the point in giving up the employment requirements now? Isn't that just a windfall to existing shareholders of Air Canada?
The honourable member for Durham, a brief answer, please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And while I admire the member's namesake, I feel he is stuck in history and frozen in time. In fact, I would invite him, as was the case 30 years ago, to fly back to Saskatchewan on Ward Air or on Canadian Airlines. No, he can't do that, Madam Speaker, because the industry has changed in 30 years. So it's perverse to suggest that Air Canada should be stuck with all the same suppliers, all the same relationships that they were 30 years ago. That's still the government controlling a private sector player. Porter has its servicing done in Sudbury. Why shouldn't companies in Sudbury or in Atlantic Canada have the same ability to bid on some of those jobs? The unionized members of those companies should have the opportunity for the jobs. It's time to recognize that it's not 1988 and he's back when he was probably 6.